All right.
Yeah.
Happy Friday, everybody. We are relatively light on content today, but we'll get started and work through some demos for sample code repo for Mr. Kalkoban. I'll talk about some roadmap updates, and then if we get Mr. Zetlin back on the line, we'll give some kind of general updates on some of the work that he's been doing around uh, uh, app creation, app starting, and scaffolding, and then we'll kind of wrap from there. So we will kick it to Mr. Mr. Copperman.
Okay.
Share.
Cool. All right, so for my demo, I'll be showing off the code samples repo. I previewed this last time we did the community sync. Basically, it's just a repository of small code samples, focus on the functionality of the different pieces of PWA Studio instead of showing off like a single application like Venia. It's just going to be smaller examples. You can see some of these examples in Peregrine documentation. I've embedded them using Code Sandbox. You can see that there's an editor here that you can modify. You can also run the actual container, the actual server, and you'll see a running instance and the example shown in the code here. The neat thing about this is you can open this in the actual Code Sandbox editor in full browser window and fork it so you can modify it. You can also see all the other examples I have. I have mask, use search param, and use query result. I'm currently working on the use query hook example, and we'll be filling this out as we make them available in NPM. I think that's it for me. Any questions?
Questions. Yeah.
Nope.
No dance. Dance on.
Hey, I'm going to try talking now.
Hey, we can hear you. So.
That's delightful. I just wanted to thank you for the code sandboxes, James, although I had to do 2 restarts and 3 Blue Jeans crashes to get here, and that's the last I'll speak of it. I know what you just demoed, and I am super duper thrilled with it. And I'm wondering if, like, code sandboxes can become the lingua franca through which we share each other's code samples, etc. Do you feel like you would be interested in doing like a demo sesh for how to use, set up, fork, and share code sandboxes? Because I think that would be really useful for people.
Yeah, we can talk about that and see what that looks like.
Yes, I'd be super into that.
American, it's probably useful in workshops and stuff.
Yeah, for sure. Great idea. Okay, so I will talk about the roadmap really quickly, and then Mr. Zetlin, maybe since we have you here and your internet seems you work in your Blue Jeans, we'll just jump to you now, and then I'll wrap up with roadmap update. How about that?
Yeah, it's weird. Does anyone remember the old like apocryphal urban internet legend of the bug that only happened on Tuesdays? Because I think I have a bug that only happens on Fridays, and it has to do with this community sync meeting. So I'm a Friday flake. But yeah, I mean, I can talk briefly. We just got the story working again that had a regression with the now.sh build yesterday that turns out not to have been our fault, but perfectly timed, am I right? For us to not have the 1404 merged that dramatically simplifies the build process. But I think it's probably worth talking about and sharing that PR all by itself. So I can talk about that, and I can talk about the general principles that that we're starting to kind of move forward with that. Does that seem like a good use of time?
Sure.
Okay. So I'll do that. First of all, hi everybody. We are really excited for the next big round of things to show you. And I thought it important to show that as we add features and as we do refactors towards newer concepts like hooks and Peregrine, that we're also working hard to keep the internal structures of the project simple. And where it's possible to simplify them, we're continuing to do so. Let's show an example of that in a pull request that we've all been working on and reviewing, called remove the mid compilation and add a Babel preset. Can you guys see my screen?
We can.
Oh my goodness, that's two things working in a row. So this pull request, perhaps most notably, removes more code than it adds, which has been super rare for me in my career. And it looks like it changes a lot of files, but the vast majority of those files are actually simple renames. And obviously there's been some additions, but mostly it's moving code around. So if you scroll through this, there really isn't that much code change. It's all just moving files from one directory to another. And you can see that the majority of those changes are moving files without touching them from the Peregrine SRC or source directory to the Peregrine LIB or library directory. That's a new directory. Essentially, we're just renaming the source directory, and Git represents that as a bunch of file moves. And then the rest of the move changes are doing the exact same thing, but in build pack, PWA build pack / SRC to, it's hard to see, but PWA build pack / lib. The reason we've done that is that in the case of both of those packages, there is no longer an independent build step because there doesn't need to be. Peregrine doesn't need to build separately because Peregrine is supposed to be consumed as ES6 modules. And that's very important because if you can import ES6 modules instead of some sort of built CommonJS format into your final app, which in our case is Venia, then your build process can identify that you've only imported some things from Peregrine or from anything else, and it can actually remove or not import the rest of that code. That's Webpack tree shaking at work, which you can look up. But in order for the tree shaking to work, it needs to be able to statically analyze which dependencies you're importing. And that is much easier. Indeed, it's really only possible when you use ES6 import and export format. So if we do a mid compilation, we would be doing something as simple as like running a couple of Babel rules on it so that it's in a more broadly consumable format. And that's what we were doing when Peregrine was compiling to ESM. So that's not great because it's just an arbitrary decision between what kind of code we write in the source files, this weird middle point, and then finally the code that's fully transpiled and bundled into Venia. So we've gotten rid of that. But now how do we make sure that all of the code that comes into Venia is using the same set of rules that the builder can understand and that Babel can transpile? What we've done is we have added a preset for Babel that we use commonly across the project instead of having a single Babel configuration at the root. And what that's done is we've moved a lot of the existing Babel configuration that's down there at the bottom, which is, where's Babel config? Let me try to, Babel config.js. You'll notice that all of this Babel configuration that we had in the root directory of our repository, which you would have to clone the entire PWA Studio repository to even use, is gone. We got rid of this and we replaced it with a much smaller configuration that's just using a preset called Magento Peregrine. Now we called it Peregrine because Peregrine is written in accordance with this Babel preset, and every other library or function or component that you bring in is going to be compiled through this same pipeline. it's important that they come from raw source through that same pipeline for tree shaking, like I mentioned before. So now that our root directory is just using a preset that we've generated, you too can use that preset by adding it as a dependency in your package. This here is the package JSON for the root directory, and it defines this dependency, but that's actually defined elsewhere. We have now a package called Babel preset Peregrine. And the way that Babel works is that when you specify something like just at Magento / Peregrine in the presets field of your Babel config, like we've done, it looks for a package called Babel -preset- whatever you put. So we have Magento Peregrine, and then we have the Babel preset. And this is importing the rules that are in use and common to all of the code that we expect to be imported into Venia. So now that we have that Babel preset, all the other packages that expect to be compiled that way are just declaring that Babel preset in their dependencies, which I'm trying to find a good example of. But because all of these packages are expected to be built inside our repository, maybe they're not there. So now that we have a Babel preset and all of those libraries use that Babel preset, we no longer need to compile Venia. So we can take all of the build steps. Sorry, I said we don't have to compile Venia. We don't have to compile Peregrine because we're just using uncompiled Peregrine modules in the final compilation. So we've removed all of the build steps. We don't need to run Babel intermediately. And we've removed the Babel dependencies from Peregrine because it's much simpler now. Instead of having that Babel dependency, Peregrine just expects the presence of Magento Peregrine, the Babel preset, and then it works. In the same place, we have build pack being renamed from source to lib. And this also represents that build pack used to have a build process just so that we could conveniently use some future ES6 features and then compile them back to a version that's compatible with Node. Well, Node is now native async await, native destructuring, and native, it doesn't have native static methods, but most of the things that we do in the build pack codebase are now native to Node. So there's no longer a need for that compilation step, so we removed it. Now there's only one build process in the whole PWA Studio repository, and that's Venia, the final endpoint. And that simplifies things a great deal. Now when you run a build, you're no longer going to run into the problem where build pack isn't present and it says you need to run a full build before running the watch mode. All of those problems will go away. So this is an example of something we're trying to simplify and then codify. The new rule is if you're writing code that is not meant to be built as part of this current package, like you're not running a build process that produces an app, then you put that code in lib. So there should be only one repository or one project with an SRC folder, and that's the final app, which makes sense because if you're importing something from an external library, it's library code. So now that's the rule. If the code is not supposed to be transpiled, like in the case of BuildPack or Upward.js, or it's only supposed to be transpiled by a consuming app downstream, like Peregrine, then you put it in a lib folder. And we're going to codify this and explain it in the wiki as well as the new rule. But once this is merged, it's just going to be a couple of directory renames, and then you'll find that the build process is faster and simpler. I wish it had been merged, but we just had a couple of regressions. We wanted to make sure that there were zero negative consequences to this. That's what I have, and I'm excited for it to come in because, again, it's rare that we get to mostly delete code. Questions?
Are any of the needed docs updates tied to this issue, or do we need to create a new one? Docs updates.
There's some doc updates there. I don't think we documented the fact that Babel preset is a required thing.
I don't think that we need to, because when you scaffold a project or when you use an existing project, it already has a set of dependencies. So like in Venia package JSON, which is actually apparently not even changed in this. Let's just jump into the tree itself and look at that. We have the new Babel preset Peregrine, but just like some of our other packages, it's just naturally inserted into the dependency scheme via package JSON. We don't, James, correct me if I'm wrong, but we don't describe and defend the use of each of these dependencies, right?
No, we don't.
Yeah, so Magento Peregrine is just another dependency. It's the dependency on the new Babel preset that we've written. And when you're compiling any kind of project, you expect there to be Babel presets and Babel plugins, just as we have here. And we just add that as an additional expected preset.
Okay, yep. And then the other one is what Zelen described, is updating the wiki for contributors, not necessarily consumers of PWA Studio, about the lib and source, because consumers don't care about that.
Yeah, we just need to describe that rule. But in the existing documentation, this pull request contains all of the necessary changes to update paths and stuff in the documentation that exists today.
Yep.
Great.
All right.
Nice.
Awesome. Thank you. Please feel free to review yourself this pull request if you like. I think it's going to be landing soon.
Great.
All right. I am unsharing.
All right. So before I just wrap up with a kind of high-level update on the roadmap, anybody else have anything they want to demo, discuss, give an update on? I'd like to do something because I know. Might, no?
Well, I mean, I've just been in deep shopper experience research mode, but it hasn't been compiled yet to be shared, but I hope to do that in the future.
All right. Didn't mean to put you on the spot there, but
That's okay.
all right. So really quickly, I think it's been first, it's been a few weeks since we've had this meeting, and then I also realized that the roadmap on the wiki is not as detailed as we'd like it to be. So over the last few weeks, we've been having a discussion about how do we make sure that that's updated. But in the meantime, I think it was appropriate to give just a quick update on our roadmap, what we're working on, where we're headed. And then obviously our goal is to make sure that all of this information is public, transparent, and that we are actively communicating when things are changing. I think obviously for everyone that's involved with trying to implement their own PWA Studio projects, that's kind of the most important thing here, is that we're just keeping everyone up to speed on where we're going and what we're delivering. So on our roadmap, right, you can see kind of where we came from in Q2 with the PWA Studio GA and the things that we were working on and that we delivered back in Q2. For the current quarter, right, the primary focus that we've had, if you've been in our backlog, has been on Peregrine and the switch over from kind of Venya purely as the implementation to using Peregrine and React hooks. And that has been the primary focus for the team, is kind of the refactor work needed to create all the necessary hooks and build out Peregrine. So we've been moving through piece by piece throughout the application, right, doing that refactor work. That refactor work is scheduled to continue even through the next quarter. And then the ultimate goal is that we will, and there's a ticket on the board that you can read through and comment on, about switching over Venya to now rely on and use Peregrine. Of course, there are some additional Venya features that like wish lists, and there's some additional checkout work that we want to complete that we kind of deferred throughout this quarter and the next quarter in order to complete the Peregrine work. But as we move into the future, into Q4 and past, right, we'll pick all of that back up and make sure that we're continuing to build out that Venya storefront experience to ensure a more complete and immersive shopper experience. At the same time, right, as we're completely tied to, or we're very much tied to what GraphQL is delivering on their side. So as GraphQL is expanding the GraphQL coverage, We are also making sure that we're including that in Peregrine and in the PWA Studio. So that effort will continue going all the way through the end of the year, where I think their roadmap for coverage is slated to kind of complete towards the end of the year. What else is worth talking about on here? I think that's, and of course, Page Builder. We've already begun discovery around Page Builder and PWA. So that'll be an ongoing effort, and that's something that we're looking to really make some big strides on and deliver on towards the end of the year and going into the next year. So I'd say stay tuned for that. We've got some great early progress, and we'll make sure that we continue to communicate out on successes there. And that's about it for a kind of high-level roadmap overview. So again, we'll look to make sure we get all of our resources that are out there on the wiki updated to be accurate with our roadmap. I think it's we're looking at how we can make sure we're communicating the changes to the roadmap. And then, of course, if there are any questions, feel free, anybody, to Slack us, email us, ask questions on where we're going and what we're delivering. Any questions?
Where is that Peregrine logo from?
Where is the Peregrine logo from? I mean, I don't actually know where it's from. I see we have Eric on the call. Maybe he wants to jump in and answer that question. But
hey guys, yeah, that is what we like to call a placeholder. So open to a review and updates as needed. So
I can see Samia. She just.
I have a big smile.
Wheels are turning. How do we
the
make
smile
this better?
covers your internal pain.
No, I mean, you were putting thoughts in my brain. I was just curious because it's something new.
We can
definitely placeholder.
Okay.
All right. So, any other questions, comments?
No.
Cool.
Happy Friday.
Happy Friday. Well then,
Happy Friday.
we will wrap up. Onwards and upwards.
Recording has ended.
Recording.
That's fine.
See you guys.
Start like
It would be kind of spectacular.